Hey class, we're in part 4, Baroque and Rococo, circa 1600 to 1800. From the end of the 16th century to the middle of the 18th century, the Baroque style was in fashion. This style used lavish ornamentation, free and flowing lines, as well as flat and curved forms. The Rococo style superseded Baroque from 1720 through 1770. Rococo style was more delicate with S and C curves, tracery, scrollwork, and fancy adaptations of Chinese, classical, and Gothic lines. In the latter part of the 18th century, one will see classical style being revived. The high demand for cheap washable fabrics was fueled by trade. Amongst imports, chintz became an important fabric. By the later half of the 17th century, chintz was in demand for not only household items such as linen, but also clothing. Lightweight muslin cotton contributed to changes in the style of women's clothing at the end of the 18th century. The result of the consumer society meant fashion was no longer exclusive to the affluent. Higher income, urban living, and the growth of retail caused the fashion to change at an accelerated rate. The 17th century, 1600 to 1700. Fashions originated and were followed by the European ruling classes in the 17th century. Other countries that dominated the Italian peninsula adopted prevailing fashions. As they gained economic and political leverage, their fashion became influential and was widely followed. The Mannerist style bridged the Renaissance and Baroque styles. 17th century Italian artists led the transition from Mannerism to the Baroque style. Social life in the 17th century. The French court and the English aristocracy. Louis XIV set the tone for monarchy style and luxury dress. His style was copied throughout Europe. Appearance at court included an expensive and varied wardrobe. During the reign of Charles II, London became the fashion leader. After seeking asylum in France, Charles II later brought back French fashion and influences to England. Costume traditions. The Puritan costume. The Puritans were not keen on the excess of dress or overdressing. In fact, their style of dress was often referred to as sad-colored or drab. Wealthy Puritans wore quality clothing with minimal decoration and color. Spanish costume. The Spanish style was more conservative, which resulted in styles such as the ruff, the Spanish farthingale, or the verdugo being prolonged. The mantilla, which is a smaller version of the mantle, is part of traditional Spanish costume. The guardainfante, a Spanish costume practice in the 17th century, had an excessively wide skirt that was in more of an oval shape as compared to the French farthingale. A basque extended the bodice of the guardainfante below the waistline and over the top of the skirt. The shoulder line was horizontal and similar to the style of necklines being worn throughout Europe. By the 1700s, the Spanish re-entered the mainstream of European fashion. Textiles and clothing. Silk fabrics became readily available and popular in the 17th century as a result of the draw loom that was used to create elaborate silk fabrics. Clothing for the upper class was produced by a tailor. For those of lower classes, clothing was made at home. Costume components for men, 17th century. 1625 to 1650. Major costume pieces included the skirt, doublet, the jacket or jerkin, and the trunk hose, or Venetians, which were knee-length breeches. The shirt became part of the actual costume rather than an undergarment. The shirt, which was made of white linen, had a full cut and a flat collar. The sleeves and the collar were decorated with lace or cut work. The doublet, which was worn over the shirt, was modified to include a skirt-like extension that reached to the hip. Breeches were either cut full throughout from the waist to the knee or were cut more closely and tapered. Outdoors, the balagne, a cloak, was worn in France, or cassocks were worn, which was a coat with a wide, full sleeve. Fashion-conscious French and English men wore their hair in a love lock. This is where one lock of hair was longer than the rest. Until the early 19th century, shoes had no distinction to left or right, as they were straight-soled. Both shoes and boots had high heels. Some shoes and boots had slap soles, which was a flat sole attached to only the front of the shoe that would slap the ground as the wearer walked, kind of like your modern-day flip-flop. The most important footwear items were knee-high boots and latches. 1650 to 1680. The length of the doublet shortened, stopping above the waist, and its sleeves stopped at the elbow. This change made shirts more visible. Breeches remained knee-length, either cut full and drawn at the knee or short and straight. Alternative style of breeches included the petticoat breeches or the Rhingraves. Much like a modern-day culotte, these breeches were actually a skirt that was divided. The hair was pulled back behind the ears and placed into a row at the back of the head. Women's shoes were very similar to those of men. Clogs with toe caps were worn in bad weather to protect the shoe from the water. The vest was introduced when Charles II wore a three-piece garment in 1666, which is thought to be the first three-piece suit. This garment consisted of a coat that stopped below the knee, a vest of the same length, and narrow breeches. Cloaks and capes continued to be worn as outerwear. Hats signified one's political affiliations. The Cavaliers were associated with wide-brimmed, low-crowned, feather-trimmed hats. The Puritans were associated with high-crowned, small-brimmed capotons. Louis XIV is credited with originating the galoche style, which was a flat-soled overshoe with a toe cap to help keep it in place. 1680 to 1710. Shirt collars were replaced by cravats, which was a separate piece that was similar to a scarf. Knee-length coats called surtout replaced doublets. These garments buttoned down the front and had fitted straight sleeves with turned back cuffs. They completely covered the breeches and vest or waistcoat. Large wigs were worn, some of which were powdered to make them white. Hats were generally carried as an accessory rather than worn due to the popularity of wigs. Flat hats were worn with cocked brims that were turned up at one or more points. A popular look was the tricorn. The brim was cocked at 3 points, which formed a triangle. High rigid boots, called jack boots, were worn for horseback riding in the later part of the 1600s. Costume components for women, 17th century. 1630 through 1660. The chemise, made out of white linen, continued to be worn as an undergarment, with gowns that served as one of many layers worn over. Under the gown was a skirt that was visible when the gown was open at the front. The French referred to the outer layer as the modeste and the underlayer as a secret. Quilted jackets that had a looser cut and a simplistic sleeve were worn in the home. Necklines were cut low. Horizontal necklines were edged with the bertha, which was a wide, flat collar. 1660 to 1680. The silhouettes of women's clothing began to change. Bodices became narrower and longer and came to a V-shaped point at the front. Heavy satin fabric was in style for formal dress. Fabrics were dyed in pastels or bright colors. Necklines were cut low, wide, and horizontal or oval shaped and had a wide lace collar or a whisk, which was a band of linen. Gowns were decorated with a row or ruffles down the front or lines of jeweled decor or a braid that was affixed on top of the seams. 1680 to 1700. Gown styles evolved, with necklines becoming more square and revealing the bosom. Corsets with heavily decorated and pronounced V's were visible. Due to the many layers that skirts had, they were quite heavy and required support of a whalebone, metal, or basket work. The mantua, a garment where the bodice and skirt were cut in one length from the shoulder to the hem, was thought to have derived from Middle Eastern robes. This garment had fullness at the back and the front and was worn over a corset and an underskirt. Capes were worn as outerwear. The fontange, a series of ruffles, was placed atop of the hair, which was built high on top of the head. Pantofles were heelless slippers that became popular at the end of the century. Costume components for men and women, the 17th century. Accessories. Major trends in accessories included gloves for both men and women that were occasionally scented with perfume, handkerchiefs, and purses for both men and women. Purses were made of beaded leather or embroidery. Fans were made with feathers and were carried by women. They were also created in a folding type of fan. Muffs that were made of silk, velvet, satin, or fur, or even trimmed in fur fabrics, were also carried by women. Ladies wore face masks. They wore them because they wanted to protect their faces against the weather or because they wanted to engage in flirtatious activity without being recognized. Aprons were worn to protect the garment beneath as the woman went about her household task. Jewelry, cosmetics, and grooming. Men wore neck chains, pendants, lockets, rings, and in the first part of the century, earrings, while women wore necklaces, bracelets, earrings, and rings. Women also placed a chain of small balls of perfume around their waist, which was referred to as a pomander ball. To protect and soften the skin, women wore night masks. Plumpers, which were small balls of wax, were also used by women to give the face a more round shape. Costume for children, 17th century. The sequence of dress for boys goes as follows. As infants, they were swaddled. Small boys later wore skirts. Boys from ages 3 to 4 years old wore robes, and boys from 6 to 7 dressed similarly to adult males. Leading strings were attached to the shoulders of the robes for boys and the dresses for girls. These small strings were used to hold the child upright as he or she learned to walk. In the 17th century, layettes were used for infants. Layettes consisted of swaddled bands, which were bands of linen that limited movement, bibs, caps, shirts, mittens, sleeves, and tailcoats, which are referred to by Americans as diapers. Breeching was a rite of passage when the first pair of breeches were presented to a young boy. Christening was a major occasion that required special attire, which consisted of undershirts, binders, bibs, a small cap, and a long embroidered christening gown. Infants who were unable to walk were dressed in what was called carrying frocks, while children old enough to walk were dressed in going frocks. Aprons or pinafores replaced bibs. Padded caps, referred to as pudding, protected the head of children learning to walk.